You're watching Sky News. We've got our press preview coming up, tomorrow's front pages. Joining us tonight, former Downing Street Communications Director Jonathan Haslam and the journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani. Welcome to you both. And amidst the front pages, The Telegraph, which announces that Tony Blair believes that David Cameron will win the next election. Why? We'll be telling you. Made in Scotland. Plenty coming up in our press previews. We take a look at the morning newspapers. First, our top stories tonight with David Cameron insisting the UK will not pay £1.7 billion being demanded by the European Union with a December the 1st deadline. Prime Minister saying it was unacceptable and unjustified. One of two nurses who contracted Ebola at a hospital in Texas has met the President at the White House after being declared free of the virus following treatment. And two people have been killed at a shooting at a school in the US state of Washington, including the suspected gunman, a student. 3 others are believed to have been critically injured. Well, it is now time for our press preview with all those papers, and joining us tonight for the headlines we have former Downing Street Communications Director Jonathan Haslam, and we have journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani. Thanks again for being with us tonight. First as ever, the front pages of all those papers. We'll start with The Telegraph, which claims that a former leader and Prime Minister, Tony Blair no less, has told friends he thinks the Conservatives will win the next election because Ed Miliband has failed to connect with voters. But the Mail has more on David Cameron's troubles, admission that Britain is more likely to vote to leave the EU after the European Commission demanded an extra £1.7 billion from the UK. The Express says the request for that money has brought new calls for an early referendum, while the Times reports that Brussels could levy a penalty charge of more than £42.5 million a month if Britain refuses to pay up. The Eye, quoting the Prime Minister, is saying the Commission has behaved in an appalling way. The FT also going with David Cameron's outrage, but adds that British officials had played a role in endorsing that new EU budget. While The Guardian reflects that Chancellor George Osborne knew of the Commission's demand for extra money 2 days before David Cameron, but didn't tell him. The Independent, with an admission from Mirror Group newspapers that it published articles likely to have been sourced from illegal phone hacking during Piers Morgan's time as the paper's editor. Mr. Morgan's always denied any direct or indirect involvement in hacking, and there's no evidence that he was involved. Turning to the Mirror itself, an interview with last year's X Factor winner Sam Bailey, who says she was stalked on the internet and feared that her children could be kidnapped. While The Sun features the woman who says she's allergic to X Factor judge Simon Cowell, with vomiting, fainting, screaming, sweating and on Prozac. Well, that's what television does to you. And the Daily Star has a story about a man on benefits who's in dispute with his counsel. So let's see exactly what sort of medical conditions Jonathan and Nabila are suffering looking at tomorrow's papers. Because certainly David Cameron seems to come out in a nasty red rash on the front of the Times. He's in the spotlight in Brussels, as the caption there reflects. The budget riot intensifying. Indeed, he is quite red in the face about it.
But he was certainly red-faced this afternoon and lectern thumping. He insisted that he wouldn't scribble up a cheque for almost £2 billion for Europe. I mean, I wonder who uses checkbooks nowadays, but I think we've got the point. And, you know, he was trying, you know, extremely hard to come across as a man of the people, and that's why he was speaking in very simple terms, reaching out to the ordinary man and woman in Britain and standing up to the EU for you know, on behalf of the Brits. And he knows that UKIP has been doing that for years, and he's been losing many voters to Nigel Farage, and you know, he's very aware of that. And Europe is certainly going to be a huge issue for the forthcoming elections, both by-election and indeed the general election.
There's a great quote there. You don't need a Cluedo set to know that someone's been clubbed with a lead piping in the library. That's going to go down.
The great danger in all of this, though, is when the story unravels and who knew what when. Part of the embarrassment comes from his Chancellor, George Osborne, who apparently knew 2 days prior to that. There are suggestions in the papers that the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, knew about this some considerable while ago. if the Treasury has fallen asleep at the wheel, they ought to have known about these things. It apparently goes back to some negotiations in 2010. And really, people should have been working through. The Prime Minister has been put in an appalling position. He's absolutely got nowhere to go. He has to go and thump the top.
Yeah.
He could find himself undermined by stuff that his officials have done, and it hasn't been properly addressed. So there's a big problem for all of them there. I think
like going to a fancy restaurant and not realising the bill hasn't been paid for.
Or your credit card doesn't work.
But there is the question as well. I mean, they're going through the figures. I mean, the next down the list is the Netherlands, 515 million. Italy, 272 million. I mean, why is our bill so high?
Because we're doing well. Britain is doing extraordinarily well.
So we're paying for our success.
And we're paying for the success, apparently, of our grey economy, our black economy, that which is not properly declared. But there seems to be a complete failure somewhere in Europe. It's a disconnect. We talk about the Whitehall disconnect.
Yeah.
You can tell us, Nabila, about the European disconnect. Don't they think in Brussels, this is a bit odd? The people in Greece are going to find it a bit odd writing us a check. You've got Cyprus, you've got the Holland. And why on earth is Germany, that powerhouse of the European economy for so long, getting a rebate?
Yeah.
I think
this doesn't make sense. And people have to say, to connect with the people of Europe, we need to have some proper answers. We're not getting them.
Well, no mention in any of the front page stories of the outgoing president, José Manuel Barroso, but he has been converted into, I think, is it Colonel Mustard on the Cluedo card there on the Sun's page 2?
Yes.
While Professor Plum, or Professor Cam as he is there. I mean, there is obviously a lot of investigation to have to go on about how they've reached this figure, because I understand some of the calculations go back to 1995, is that right?
It may be a rolling 20-year programme, but I mean, you're trying to find this out from the press, and heaven knows they've tried their best. You can't find people in Brussels who will explain it to them at the moment.
And
so there's a big problem going on here, and it's as though it's one of those routine things that nobody has paid attention to. No one has applied any political sense to the dynamics of Europe and the dynamics of what's going in the UK, and it's caught everybody by surprise.
What's likely to be the response in France, which of course is going to get some money back, it looks as...
Well, I think France is keeping a close eye on what's happening here, and of course, as you said, it's going to get some money back, get some close to a million
euros.
Well, no, billion, 1 billion pounds, close to 1 billion pounds in rebate for performing extremely poorly. And but there are serious, issues with the whole thing. France has been described as a basket case economy, and for all the right reasons. It's.
But why worry if the EU is going to bail you out?
Yeah, but there's also, I think, there's an opportunity here, and I'm sure the politicians will be thinking about it. France has an argument over its debt in the Eurozone. It's going to look for some flexibility from the European Commission. I'm sure Italy and Greece
old hand
will be thinking, and the Dutch government will be thinking, well, OK, France, you want a bit of flexibility. We want a reduction.
And that
here.
might allow Cameron to buy some time for himself as well.
Cameron, of course, we're outside the euro. You don't have that influence. That's one of those issues.
Let's just mention in passing, before we leave that on page 2, you've also just noticed the little paragraph, couple of paragraphs there. Brussels top bureaucrat being blasted for using taxpayers' cash on a 600-page book boasting of his achievements.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Really?
Wow.
It's just one of those things you do, isn't it? Pictures of yourself with the great and good. A collection of your speeches, I'm sure they're all riveting, and not a single thought about what it means to people.
But it's another example, dare I say, of exactly how much money there is in the EU as an institution, how much anybody can make money out of the EU. There's a shady line between the amount of legitimate money you can make out of the EU and the illegitimate
what used to be called the
of
Brussels gravy train.
Yes, and still is the case.
€6 billion.
Pensions are fantastic, salaries are amazing. You have politicians who were anti-Europe and who, became converted once they realised they could make a lot of money out of it.
OK, let's head back to the front pages now. The Telegraph. And it has on the left a splash saying that the Conservatives will win the next general election because Ed Miliband has failed, according to a certain Tony Blair.
That's right, I remember him.
Well, I never.
Well, it's a time of Gothic revival at the moment. So, you know, somebody's taken the stake out of his heart, and he's back there eating and expressing points of view.
One ought to point out, he said this privately to friends, and it is being challenged by Tony Blair's office.
And to be fair, his office say this is not his recollection of events. So you can find that right down at the bottom, and the 8-point coverage there.
I think it says what we thought of him all along, that he is indeed a Tory, and that he was far more interested in making money than in the advancement of society. I mean, he, you know, turned all traditional Labour Party oriented toward trade unions into a political, into an electoral machine.
Yeah, but I mean, the interesting thing is that it follows comments, of course, as it reflects there of Lord Prescott, who was perhaps more old Labour than Tony Blair was.
Just a bit.
And he has accused Ed Miliband of appealing only to traditional Labour supporters and disaffected Liberal Democrats, where, of course, David Miliband was always seen as an arch Blairite.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Well, you couldn't get two more different sides of the equation. Here, of course, one of the arguments is that, certainly from the Blair camp, Miliband has not really addressed the immigration issue and those cornerstone things in the current debate at the moment, which really are affecting UKIP and its support. So he is going for the core vote.
Many accuse the Blair government of...
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, they're all culpable.
And I think he honestly likes the type of Cameron, a slick PR, modern politician, and it may well be that he thinks his money, of course, will be safer under a Conservative government than a Labour one. I think that's a fair point to make.
No mansion tax, please, says Tony Blair.
Yeah.
OK, well...
Several mentions. I mean, it's an issue, isn't it?
OK, well, coming up, the Asda price could be quite a high price too. The supermarket workers who say they're worth the same pay as the company's warehouse staff. We'll be looking at that in a moment for you. Welcome back to our press preview. It's welcome back, of course, to Jonathan and Nabila as we head inside the papers now. It is page 10 of the Daily Mail. This is an extraordinary story about this undercover police operation which has left this woman with, quite a legacy and now £425,000 compensation.
Yes, well, no amount of money in the world is going to compensate somebody for 24 years of heartache and 24 years when you've been abandoned and there is a child involved, not a child any longer, but someone apparently who is trying to build something of a relationship with the father who left after a couple of years. And the terrible thing is that there are another 12 cases here, and quite rightly Theresa May has said there should be a proper inquiry into all of this. It is quite mind-boggling that we can have our public authorities undertaking this sort of activity. And there
police
being no
neither confirming nor denying the identity of the officers, that they are still effectively faceless beings.
Yes, and no doubt lawyers are right behind them saying we'll keep the costs down and don't go too far with this story. But, I mean, it is a shocking episode.
It is, and she clearly feels aggrieved.
We really do need to have a transparency and a light shone on this, because we have all of the problems with Hillsborough, we've got all the problems with South Yorkshire Police, the stuff we're still seeing coming out of Rotherham and Sheffield. And to get that confidence back, we need to have this light on all of these issues and make sure it doesn't happen again.
And a reflection on the damage done to the individuals. I mean, Ashish Joshi, our correspondent, spoke to this activist, Jackie. This is what she had to say to him a little earlier today.
We're talking about 30 years of my life that they've taken from me. Rites of passage from a girl to a woman. My first love was him. My first pregnancy was with him.
I mean, it's extraordinary. It's not just obviously a brief affair or some kind of infatuation. I mean, this woman's life was completely taken over.
Yes, a long-running relationship as far as she was concerned, a firm, solid relationship. They had a child together.
That's why I think she deserves
an issue of
every
animal rights, not exactly, perhaps some would say, the most...
One can understand. I mean, if we go back that length of time, you do understand that there were bomb threats, there was a lot of very nasty activity going on, and it certainly was one of those issues. I worked in the Home Office with David Mellor when there were animal rights legislation going through. and he worked terribly hard with all the right authorities to get some very effective legislation going through. You can understand the concern, you can understand the need for the police to investigate. This just went too far.
Yeah.
OK. Telegraph now, back to the front pages. And it is the teenage gunman who's opening fire at the high school. Now, this has just been going on in the United States tonight, Washington State, north of Seattle. And as Dominic, our US correspondent, was reflecting, it is just so familiar now.
Yes.
And one wonders what happens to these, because the gunman shot dead, two people, the gunman believed to be a student at the school. What happens to these youngsters?
Well, it's a terrible state of affairs, and it seems to be a problem that America is not willing to address effectively. You know, it, of course, all relates to gun violence, and you know, these are the stories we hear about that make the headlines, make newspapers. It happens every day. It's not mentioned every day in the newspapers. It, you know, and it's just so terribly sad that a society, firmly believes that holding guns is the key to their own security. It obviously isn't.
Yeah. Yes, as Nabila says, I mean, there are so many murders going on. There was a story recently that Chicago, which seems to have several murders and gunshot murders a week.
Oh, always has.
Always has, yes.
Yeah.
But American Army surgeons are sent to Chicago to understand how to deal with that kind of trauma.
Injuries, yeah.
I
mean, we can see the pictures there, the helicopter shots as people are running to safety. I mean, the other aspect is we were told that, the security at these high schools had been tightened, that there were scanners, that there were security staff. But clearly, it is still very, very straightforward for a student of the school, who obviously is seen every day. If they do go off the rails, they just go in and get access to.
But I think they got the perspective wrong on how to deal with the problem. For example, they're selling more bulletproof material, bags for kids, and they seem to be seeing that as a solution.
Kevlar school uniforms, bulletproof school uniforms.
We're spending a lot of time now in the UK particularly, and in Canada of course, thinking about those boys who are radicalised and they're going off the rails, and girls as well. And it does mean that we've got to be really very, very vigilant and thinking about young people, all of the strains and stresses that they face in their lives, and look for those people who are
and seek to address them,
vulnerable, and they have their own mental disturbances.
Let's just go fast forward to the Scottish clock on page 3 of the Times, shall we? Because we were reflecting earlier that the drink-drive limit might be altered north of the border. Now the clocks may be as well. Scottish clocks could tick an hour behind English ones. Who needs devolution when you've got all this, eh?
Well, I don't know. It's like two separate countries, really, isn't it?
Well, there's the thing.
Quite remarkable. Well, Scotland has always been extremely conservative in this regard, which is quite unusual, bearing in mind the strength of the SNP. And it looks as though it could be one of those issues up for grabs, according to William Hague and campaigners. And certainly there seems to be a suggestion that when this idea was mooted in the past, in 2012, the government whips decided it would be a bad idea to upset the Scots by having a change to the time of the clocks. So maybe we are going to get a daylight saving.
And it would allow a lot of school children north of the border to go to school in the daylight. And that's a problem at the moment. They go to school in the dark.
Yes.
Could it affect trade relations as well? Would it make a difference?
I don't know. Relations are a little fraught at the moment, I think, all the way around with Scotland, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But we shall see what happens because, of course, let's not forget this weekend our clocks do go back here and north of the border as well. Indeed. Thank you for your selection. We'll see you again soon.